Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me? Good morning, everyone. I know this room is going to fill to bursting. None of us can ever start on time, but we have such an extraordinary group of people in discussion today. It would be a shame to cut anybody short. For that reason, I'm not going to linger. I'm not going to hog the microphone. But, I think that I look out over this crowd already and see many of the people who taught me, many of the people who have been in discussion with me over these many years. And I was thinking this morning about what I could say to kick this day off. I was thinking, what made Joseph extraordinary and unique? The problem for me is that, for me, he's not unique because I almost don't know any different. Everything that I learned, mainly in Cambridge and then subsequently, came out of his thinking and his writing. To me, it is somehow the only way, which probably makes me a sort of inappropriate person to start this off. But really, that not knowing any different to someone who has the scope and the breadth of interest and understanding, someone whose work has informed, teaching I was just doing last week to first-year undergraduates here on the Roman Forum. So going back to the idea of a town, through to my own PhD work with the First Moderns. I don't really know any part of my teaching or my own work that hasn't been touched by Joseph. Certainly, and also through the teachers that I've had who I can see here. It is remarkable and a great honor to be able to host today here at the AA, one of his alma maters, although I feel that he has been, again, he's touched almost every institution that I can think of. And I'm looking forward tremendously to the range of voices that we will hear from. They are extraordinary in their own right. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to hand over to Ellis Woodman, who can kick us off. Thank you, Ellis.
Thank you, Ingrid. I think I'm one of the few non-academics in the room, but I thought maybe we'd just have a quick show of hands. Did anybody, I presume everybody knew Joseph personally or was a student of Joseph? Are there anyone here who's kind of, few people who are perhaps kind of fresh to him? I just thought, nonetheless, I'm going to, because the purpose of this morning is really to focus on Joseph's academic, his teaching career, particularly at Essex and Penn, and I thought it would be worth giving a kind of whip through of biography up until the point that Joseph becomes a teacher. So just very briefly, Joseph was born in Warsaw in 1926 and arrived in the UK as a refugee in 1939. Studied at the Bartlett then, which was then based at in Cambridge during the war years, where Albert Richardson was, of course, teaching in 1942 to 1944, and was here at the Architectural Association immediately after the war. During this period, he was attending Rudolf Wittkower's seminars at the Warburg, and also working in architectural offices, notably there's the Max Fry and Jane Drew office, and the mysterious figure of Clive Entwistle, briefly, who features in Remembering Places, the book that we're going to be celebrating the new edition of at the end of today. And he was, during the 40s, early 50s, writing for the Architects Journal. He was Astragal, some of you will know, kind of the kind of gossip columnist for the Architects Journal, and spending quite substantial times in Italy, where he began to engage directly with work of figures like Ernesto Rogers, and was writing for magazines including Domus. But the teaching career really begins with his appointment at Hammersmith School of Arts and Crafts, and subsequently he teaches a winter semester at Ulm in 1957 to 58. This is just following the publication of the translation of Alberti's 10 books. 1961, Joseph is appointed as the librarian at the Royal College of Art, and in 1967, which is where I'll leave the story for now, he's appointed as the founding professor of art at the University of Essex and sets up the master's course in architectural history and theory. So today, this morning, we're going to hear from a number of former students and colleagues of Joseph. But to kick us off, I'm going to welcome to the stage kind of Yonggao Shi, who's from the Southeastern University School of Architecture, and is going to talk to us a little about the Joseph Rykwert Fellowship that's been established.
It is a great pleasure to be here today, and I would like to begin by expressing my sincere thanks to AA and Marina Engel for a kind invitation to this event. On behalf of the Asian Architectural Archive Center at Southeast University, now the current custodian of Joseph Rykwert's library, I am honored and delighted to announce the opening of applications for the Joseph Rykwert Research Fellowships offered at both senior and junior levels. Named after the esteemed scholar, Professor Joseph Rykwert, this fellowship aims to support research that draws upon the extraordinary resources of our archive center. At the same time, it serves as a tribute to Professor Joseph Rykwert, a way to remember his profound influence and to preserve and extend his intellectual legacy. Established as the first international architectural document and archive center in China, the AAAC, the Asian Architectural Archive Center, originated through the collaboration of academician Zhang Guangqun, former president of Southeast University, and Professor David Ledberow, the foreign dean or international dean of Architecture Internationalization Demonstration School at Southeast University. This initiative, realized with the support of the Nanjing municipal government and Southeast University, officially commenced on August 27, 2022. Housed in a recently renovated building within the historic campus, the old campus of Southeast University, the AAC is equipped with study and meeting rooms, as you see on the left, exhibition space, offices, also advanced storage and library facilities. Its core missions include archival collection, exhibition, also activities like research, education, and academic exchange. That's forming a foundation for the kinds of practice that will make positive contributions to contemporary society. The Archive Center engages with multiple disciplines of architecture, urbanism, and landscape architecture, as considered within their broader cultural and environmental contexts. Its multidimensional approach also embraces arts, humanities, and sciences, cultivating a well-rounded perspective that aligns with its missions. With the Rykwert Library as our initial and cornerstone acquisition, along with other present and future collections, the Joseph Rykwert Fellowship provides a fertile ground for advanced research, embedded within the dynamic academic community of Southeast University and the rich intellectual and cultural fabric of the city of Nanjing. The fellowships are available for various periods. Fellows will receive monthly stipends sufficient to cover living and accommodation expenses in Nanjing, as well as a standard travel allowance for round-trip airfare. Fellows are encouraged not only to devote time to their individual research projects, but also to take part in lectures, symposia, and other academic activities at Southeast University, engaging actively with the local academic and architectural community. Now, as we open this new chapter, we hope the Joseph Rykwert Fellowship will not only bring scholars to Nanjing, but also send new ideas from Nanjing out into the world. Through study, exchange, and friendship, we aim to build a living bridge between cultures and generations, a bridge that continues the legacy of Joseph Rykwert and keeps alive the spirit of curiosity, reflection, and imagination that his work has inspired in us all. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. We have a cast of thousands this morning, so some of whom are you're going to see as recordings, but there are quite a few of them in the room, so I'm going to whip through it at some pace so that we all get to lunch. Huge pleasure to start the session today by introducing to the stage Dawn Adders, who's art historian of surrealism and Latin American art, and was one of Joseph's first appointments at Essex, when he set up the pioneering art and architecture history department in the late 60s. And Valerie Fraser, again, specialist in Latin American art and architecture, who was one of Joseph's students from that period. Valerie, Dawn.
Can you hear? All right. Yes, thank you. I'm afraid we don't have any images ourselves, but I'm very happy to have this wonderful photograph of Joseph behind us to remember. When I was asked to speak about Joseph at the University of Essex, I realized that there was a hugely important aspect of that I couldn't speak to, and that was his teaching. I was a junior member of the department. I joined in autumn 1968, crucially autumn, for all sorts of reasons, and Val came up as a student at the same time. So Val is going to talk more about the teaching, and I'll just sketch in something about Joseph's time at Essex. Of course, Joseph loved both books and buildings, things. In 1967, when he was 41, he left the comparative calm of the post of librarian at the Royal College of Art for the bracing position of Chair of Art at the new University of Essex, which had begun life in 1965, so it was quite new. He was the first chair in a new department. It was called the Department of Art, not History of Art, nor History and Theory of Art, as it became. And Joseph's account of his appointment is very interesting for the light it casts on the difference between his approach to the subject and the conventional academic one. Two people were shortlisted for the job, Joseph and the painter-historian Lawrence Gowing, who already had a university chair, was a distinguished painter, as well as the author of several books. In a decade my senior. I'm quoting from additions to the memoir Remembering Places, which is shortly to be published. So this is Joseph speaking. His approach to the teaching of art history, that's Lawrence Gowing, centered on a critical account of the previous centuries' painting and sculpture, and it tended to the conventional. I inevitably approached it through architecture and through the design of everyday things, which set works of painting and sculpture in a social as well as intellectual context, and Joseph won. So he was allowed one permanent appointment to join him then, but he had great difficulty finding the right person. Alan Bowness, who placed so many of his court-old graduates in the new universities, including myself, recommended T.J. Clark. So when I joined as a very junior part-time lecturer in autumn 1968, the department was very small. It was just Joseph and Tim. And as Joseph later wrote, I couldn't foresee that Essex was to become the epicenter of the 1968 events in England, and that Clarke would assume the role of a student leader in them, and that's really another story. The Department of Art joined the existing departments of literature, government, and sociology to form the School of Comparative Studies. Sarah Simmons and I were appointed to teach on the radical first-year course, the so-called Common First Year, which all students took before it's a wonderful principle in my view, which all students took before deciding on their degree course. It had an experimental structure. We taught 18th century in the first term, 20th century in the second term, and Revolution in the third. Now, I'm taking the next incident from an interview that Joseph did with Alan Elkan, which was published after he died. Joseph accepted the chair on condition that he could run an MA course in the history and theory of architecture. This was advertised, and a few people applied. One day, the Vice-Chancellor summoned him. This was 1968, so Joseph assumed it was trouble. Essex, some of you may remember, was at the centre of the événement of 68, with very active student protests. However, this wasn't the trouble he had anticipated. The Vice-Chancellor, Albert Sloman, asked Joseph what the RIBA had against him. Joseph replied that he didn't think they even knew he existed. Sloman replied that not only did they know he existed, but they were aware of the MA programme he was planning to start in the history and theory of architecture, were very worried about it, and told Sloman to stop it. Joseph asked what he said to them, and Sloman replied that he told them professors in his university teach what they think is best, and it was none of their business. So it went ahead and was the first such course anywhere. And I'm sure its success and its legacy will be talked about as we go on, as well as what might have been, what it might have been that the RIBA feared. Joseph brought in a starry cast of part-time teachers for the course, one of whom was Robert Hughes, but then not quite the legendary figure he became. Joseph recalled him doing a seminar on Goya and bringing his collection of original Goya engravings to show the students. And I remember Bob Hughes had a real Hannah Hole photomontage hanging in his room at Essex. Another of the brilliant people he brought in to teach at Essex was Dalibor Vézelay, with whom I shared an interest in surrealism. Once, Dalibor volunteered me for a lecture here at the AA on surrealism in architecture. And the only problem was he forgot to tell me. So it never happened. Something I much regret is that Dalibor and I never completed a plan we had to translate and publish a number of original Czech surrealist texts which he had brought with him and which I still have. Reading Remembering Places, Joseph's memoir, recently, it was brought home to me how narrow and conventionally academic, even provincial, we, or myself certainly, must have seemed to him, by contrast with his experience. His background, an escape from Poland in the late 1930s, his time as a wandering student walking through Italy, studying architecture in various contexts, and then teaching at the new Bauhaus at Ulm, and the friends he made all over Europe, such as Umberto Eco. But nonetheless, he was a generous and inspiring colleague, and we remain friends for the rest of his life.
Well, Dawn is very much more thorough than I have been in preparing this. But one of the things that I remember most about Joseph is his smile. It was just invigorated the entire department. To meet Joseph, because the department was very small and very close, and he was Joseph to students. He was always Joseph. He was never Rykwert, or Professor Rykwert, whatever. It was always Joseph, and everybody smiled at him all the time. So if I'm grinning a bit much, that's a Joseph memory. I went to Essex, as Dawn was saying, as an undergraduate in 1968, and I chose Essex And this is, I think, Joseph's sort of underlying sense, because Essex was so interdisciplinary in its structure. I hadn't a clue what I wanted to do. I just knew that I wanted to go to university. And the interdisciplinary, as Dawn was saying, was sort of the foundational model of the university, the arts side of things. I did a preliminary language year in Spanish because I didn't know what to do and thought, well, I might as well learn a language. And that was 1968, 1969. And so we were meant to be going to Mexico. We went to Mexico, we got to the border, and we were refused entry because that was what happened in those days, because Essex was radical and so was Mexico, and they didn't want more problems. But I then did the common first year, which had very much had Joseph at its heart. From him I learnt all the bases of architecture, the orders, the classical structures, and because I think this is incredibly important, because he was such a believer in looking at real things in the flesh, at buildings and paintings and pottery, sculpture, whatever, not just photographs, that an essential part of the Essex course was gallery visits, studio visits, going to Florence, going to Venice, going to London. And it was an extremely important part of my undergraduate experience, these visiting things with him and with other members of staff, and visiting galleries, visiting buildings. And one example that sticks in my mind is that Joseph took us, because it was handy, from Colchester to Liverpool Street. There are quite a lot of 18th century churches in easy access. I think one of the things that really struck me was the Nicholas Hawksmoor Christ Church, Spitalfields, from about the 1720s or something. And its extraordinary radical facade. This is one of the things that Joseph was so good at bringing out. It was just a classical temple portico, but then with a great big arched entrance in the centre of it. Just a really striking juxtaposition that helped shape my thinking about architecture, helped me see things differently, helps me look at this room and think, what's the design here you're going on? And that's what lay behind. Joseph was very encouraging about my future career, and he recommended that I went to Warburg. I did an MPhil at Warburg, and then I went back to Essex to do a PhD and to take up a lectureship there. And I did my PhD in the colonial architecture of 16th century architecture of Peru, and I just as a sort of this was based on Rykwert's identification of the orders and of the structure of buildings that I really hadn't sort of understood until he, it's all about his education. Anyway, I think that's more or less all I have to say, except that this then became one of my key books. I mean, this is he wrote this, I think, probably while he was teaching the Enlightenment. He must have done at Essex, because this has got all, not only all those churches that I was so impressed about, and I'm continuing to visit to remind myself about these wonderful places. But this must have grown out of the Enlightenment course, I think, at Essex. So I think that's it. Okay.
We have a little time for kind of questions if people have them. I was hoping to ask really about just the contrast between the kind of art history that Joseph was promoting and the kind of Warburg Courtauld tradition that you were familiar with. And I'd be interested to just hear about Yeah, well, were there points of resistance from existing art and architectural historians to the kind of method that was being promoted at Essex?
I'm sure we'll both have a word to say about that, but very quickly to say that actually Joseph, in a way, was different both from the Courtauld and the Warburg themselves, very different from each other in their approaches, because the Courtauld at the time was trying to discover what art history could be as a discipline, whereas at the Warburg, people were perfectly sure that it was part of the history of ideas and part of philosophy. So there was that difference already, which young art historians like myself were sort of seeking to understand. What I remember, I mean, I wasn't taught by Joseph because I was teaching with him, as it were, but I do remember him setting up a course. I'm not sure whether this was when you were undergraduate or not, but where he was teaching the Renaissance, but through, as it were, the things people lived with, not just sort of looking at fine architecture or wonderful paintings, but looking at the entire sort of area, which I think was, not, I mean, one of the things he mentions in his memoir is the difficulty that traditional art historians have in recognising or in expanding their category of what deserves to be talked about, in a sense. So, typography, which is something that Joseph obviously loved, and he regarded as extremely important and could indeed have an aesthetic effect. Most art historians wouldn't have the foggiest what to do with it. So it was that kind of generosity and sort of desire to understand where we are in the world that I think was so important and really changed a rather fuddy-duddy discipline to something more exciting.
I'm interested to find out if Joseph expressed at that time an attitude towards Rudolf Wittkower's work, which I myself always thought of as a kind of architectural version of Panofsky's idea of iconology and the incorporation of theory into the understanding of architecture, which Wittkower had led in the 1940s, let's say. But one of my first conversations with Joseph, when I mentioned Colin Rowe, student of Wittkower, said, it's not quite, So there's some continuity, I think, between Wittkower, but some very deep differences.
I can't answer that. I really, no, it's
He does talk in his memoir about Colin Rhodes and Wittkower, and I'm trying to remember what it is he says that was that slight difference. I think you're right. But perhaps somebody else would answer that. Yeah.
He does note in Remembering Places that his first attraction to architecture was attending a lecture by Wittkower. And he felt as though, he told me, he felt as though he was, as with Gideon, a wayward student of Wittkower. About Rowe, he was more circumspect in his comment. I don't think he wanted to extend himself there.
I think saying a wayward student is absolutely correct if you look at that trajectory. No, I mean, he didn't accept anything, I feel, as something that had to be believed in terms of architectural theory and history.
I think that's right.
Of course, Joseph was also a practitioner. He was crucially. I mean, there's this wonderful quote which Helen Thomas gives in the very good essay in the AA Files from 2013 about Joseph's teaching. But she's quoting a History and Architectural Education seminar, a symposium from 1980, and Joseph's saying, the history of architecture done by architects is important. It's because we as architects know how we proceed when we are on the drawing board and how we make decisions that we can understand certain decisions of past architects. I still remember talking with a colleague about a certain very distinguished art historian. The colleague to whom I was speaking said, you see, X is extremely learned and very ingenious, but the trouble with him is that he's like a very clever eunuch in a brothel. He knows who does it with whom, how many times, which way and in which room, but what he can't understand is why they want to do it in the first place. Could you say a little about Did you have a sense of that
Yeah.
his experience as a designer, was impacting on
Very much
his teaching
so.
method?
Well, yes, I think he probably did. I think he talked a lot about chairs. Actually, I remember him discussing chairs, designing chairs, and he obviously felt he, still could do that. And if you read the Remembering Places, it must have seemed while he was, growing up, if you like, and learning and travelling, that his future would either be with books, because he loved books, or as a practicing architect. So the fact that he ended up in a way as an academic is almost a sort of a chance thing, partly through meeting people, talking to friends at the Savile Club. That seems to be how he actually got the. So I think he was always surprised himself that he didn't practice more.
Valerie, maybe I could just, you mentioned a little about the proximity to to churches and became part of the kind of teaching, the teaching focus. That the university itself was a new university campus, and in many ways sort of perhaps emblematic of the kind of technocratic, kind of urban thinking of the kind that Joseph was critiquing. How did you feel that the experience of being in that particular location sort of informed the teaching culture?
Did it inform teaching culture? I mean, it was there were very few people. It was very small numbers around. It was incredibly friendly. But the structure meant that you were bumping into people as you went round the corner all the time from different departments, different interests. And, well, there was Joseph and everybody, we all went down the bar at lunchtime. It was all so easy to mix and chat, and that distinction between staff and students didn't exist really hardly at all. That's sort of, one little anecdote I meant to say was that Joseph was a bit erratic. He wasn't always around when you expected him to be around. And one of the things that was a sort of joke was, "Where's Joseph? Oh, he must be in Milan."
I think if there's no more questions from the floor, we should move on. But thank you so much, Dawn and Valerie.
Thank you.
So we move on. Next, to be joined by David Leatherbarrow, Professor Emeritus at the University of Pennsylvania, having previously undertaken his PhD with Joseph as supervisor, but then became teaching colleague with Joseph at Penn. David, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a great pleasure to be here among friends and others associated with Joseph. Though William Carlos Williams was from Philadelphia and a graduate of Penn, and I know that Joseph liked him, we never discussed it, but I thought maybe this very beautiful quotation from Hardcore of Beauty might orient you toward what I'd like to say in basically 4 recollections of my time with Joseph. Peculiar, puzzling, and not altogether attractive is what I remember I thought of the first architectural detail that Joseph asked me to look at closely. Over the years, in our several forms of collaboration, I came to expect him to point out other oddities and incidentals that I might give some thought to and read closely. The initial urging occurred half a century ago, July 1974 in Venice. More specifically, the third and smallest and I think least attractive courtyard of the cloisters attached to San Francesco della Vigna, whose facade by Palladio you see on the left, less well known than those of Il Redentore and San Giorgio Maggiore, on the right, we had just casually walked by, but would revisit after puzzling over the courtyard's windowsills. I was among a small group of third-year summer program students. Daniel Liebeskind had been touring through the cities and landscapes of Veneto. Joseph had asked Danny had asked his former teacher, Joseph, to walk us through the canal city, explaining its history and buildings. More importantly, I think, the ideas they represented. In an essay titled On Function and Representation, published just a couple years later, Joseph retraced the approach we had just taken. Quote, "You go through the north transept door in San Francesco della Vigna, cross the cloister, and find yourself in a little courtyard. The windows which face onto it are so odd, they arrest the attention of anyone used to 17th or 18th century Venetian architecture. Yet they were plainly built, Joseph says, with scientific solidity and with an elegance which is not capricious. The little building," and then he says, "miserable as it is," suggests that Carlo Lodoli was after something more ambitious than accommodating practical purpose only, namely the invention of new ornamental forms that would display the energies inherent in them by a translation into a geometrical analog, end quote. Were I to have provided the account, I would not have described the sill as elegant. Nevertheless, Lodoli's precept, a rough translation would be, "Nothing should be put in representation that is not in function," makes Joseph's title clear. That such a sill wouldn't break like most others in the city was plain enough. How could it with that, let's say, eye bag, periorbital arc? But hard to follow understates the difficulty this undergraduate had grasping the professor's account of Venetian culture, Enlightenment science, Lodoli's theory, for the histories to which he referred seemed exotic, the concepts hard to penetrate, especially when rendered in an English that was qualified every now and then with phrases and terms in Italian, French, or even Latin. Still, he'd drawn me in. I wanted to know more about the detail and more about its world. Odd in itself, but evidently key to one of the primary topics in architectural history and theory, basically the content of the form. Though I didn't know it at the time, the style and aims of Joseph's teaching vividly on show during that first on-site lesson. As I understand it now, and I think had a sense of it then, first, begin with what you see, not with what you've read or heard about, and try to see things as they are and as ideas, as William Carlos Williams insisted in the injunction I've used as my title, and try to see particularly small things, as Abby Warburg had insisted well before his God in details phrase was popularized by Mies van der Rohe, or perhaps Philip Johnson on his behalf. Next, I understood that I was to move toward, not away from, what seemed foreign and remote, combining the best of my imagination and study to reconstruct the conditions and desires that gave rise to what I had in view. Finally, take the risk of sharing with others what I'd seen and understood, just as he had done with us. The ocean of books called London Library on St. James Square is where Joseph said I should spend much of my time when I became his student 2 years later in 1976. Dutifully, I became a member, though the fee pained me. It ate up most of the small allowance the Fulbright Commission had given scholars for books and library fees. Worse still, his recommendation exposed a double misconception I'd been suffering. First, that I'd learned most from his lectures and seminars, together with those of his teaching colleague and my other professor, Dalibor Vesely. Second, that architecture libraries, particularly the RIBA, would supply me with my study materials. Neither assumption was correct. In point of fact, I used the Warburg Institute Library just as much as London Library, for they too allowed borrowing, even 18th century books. And it was another collection Joseph had recommended because he used it himself, as did many of the people he encouraged me to read in those very days. Witkover and Panofsky, also Cassira, Saxel, and Vint. And I think, though I enjoy the others perhaps most delightfully, Dame Frances Yates, who I often passed in the stacks. The drawers of the card catalog Joseph was fingering when I walked into the London Library issue hall were only partly filled with entries for architecture books. The bulk of the collection was in the humanities, stemming from Thomas Carlyle's interest and efforts in establishing an independent library in 1841. He'd become frustrated with the policies of the library at the British Museum, a reaction I came to share 135 years later. In due course, I read Carlyle, liking most Sartor Restartus, because it clarified what was really at stake, I think, in Adolf Loos's Bekleidungsprinzip, though it didn't help me much with Joseph's sartorial choices. Probably you remember, as I do vividly, his lime green and bright pink neckties. Fields that neighbor architecture have always been the London Library's strengths: literature, fine and applied art, history, biography, philosophy, religion, topography, and travel. Social sciences, rather lightly covered. Pure and natural sciences and technology, not at all. Those latter subjects, I admit, would attract my attention later and elsewhere. But for Joseph, architecture was to be studied within the context of subjects we count among the humanities. Subjects that prepare a person to act knowingly, effectively, and fairly in contemporary culture. Languages were exceedingly important. He expected competence in German. Thus, I immediately started classes at Goethe Institute on Exhibition Road, also French and Italian. High expectations for English usage were likewise in force. To get up to speed, he recommended close reading and imitation of someone whose command of the language he thought exemplary. Turns out it was Joseph Conrad, whose first language, you probably know, was Polish, like Joseph's. I asked him why Conrad, when it was Polish. He said it's for that reason that his English is so good. Heart of Darkness is where I started. Mirror of the Sea became more important, especially its opening chapter. It's very beautiful if you haven't read it, for architects, called Landfalls and Departures. The account of shoreline asymmetry I interpreted analogically as characteristic of all manner of boundaries, especially those that define buildings. But my models of usage became the spectator essays of Addison, Steele, Pope, and particularly Swift, because my research field was 17th and 18th century architecture and gardens. Research he pushed and followed closely because he was working on first moderns at the time. But thanks to Joseph's endorsement of analogical thinking and especially of metaphor, I've come to see architecture as a cultural practice, sibling to other productive arts, literature, sculpture, and painting, but also kin to anthropology and philosophy. For my part, I think Varro was right when he placed architecture and medicine among the liberal arts. We didn't stay long in the issue hall. Joseph wanted tea, not anywhere. It had to be Fortnum and Mason's, lower level tea room 3 blocks away. He enjoyed the tea and biscuits more than I did, delighted in the slow and steady parade of models around the table and what I guess were the newest fall fashions. I honestly can't remember how our ranging conversation turned to the matter of his role as a teacher. But at some point, he flatly said, "David, I'm no guru." No explanation followed, but I took the notification to mean at least 2 things. That he wouldn't perform the center stage role of those design professors who convert and then assemble acolytes around them. And 2, I shouldn't expect of him unequivocal answers to questions that were important to me. Nevertheless, the curiosity that was evident in all the questions he was asking gave me the impression that here was a teacher who had never graduated, one who was still a student. 15 years earlier, Le Corbusier expressed something similar in his AIA Gold Medal speech. Quote, Corbusier, "Thinking what I see and seeing everything in architecture means leading a dog's life. There are problems before us. Values change daily. The world explodes, and I, for one, am still living a little in the skin of a student." If true, the admission's revealing, if also more than a little self-praising. Joseph reports in Remembering Places that it wasn't as a student that Le Corbusier played his part at the Bergamo Siam conference. Joseph, I'm quoting, dominated the event effortlessly. As Joseph, if I'm not mistaken, observe here, already a scholar, his book bag between him and the table. Underused and dusty is the way I describe the high-ceilinged hall of plaster cast that I passed through on my way to the room in the basement of the Royal Academy, where I had my first and only seminar course with Joseph. Remembering Places reports that we met in the President's Hall. I think Joseph's memory failed him here, unless he taught in that room the year before. If you visit the basement today, you see something very different, well-lit, refined, even grand. The approach I took in 1976 and 7 was through an archway on Burlington Gardens, down a muse-like passage to the lowest level of the Burlington building, well past the cast, at the end of a narrow and indirect corridor, Brian will remember this, was a tiny room that had been used for developing photographic film. Around our 12-seat meeting table were countertop developing trays used for photographic film. Bone dry, with trace odors that were mercifully in due course displaced by far more likable smells of fresh coffee from the machine he bought in Fortnum & Mason's for our second session. I sat near Joseph. Mohsen Mostafavi sat across from me, and that was the beginning of a friendship under Joseph's direction that led to the 2 of us co-authoring 2 books. A nearby circular stairway led up to the indirect entry into the Royal Academy Library, from which Joseph borrowed books that were the subject matter of our seminars. I suppose he had Sir Hugh Cashin's permission, but the book borrowing, I have to admit, seemed entirely covert when I assisted him. He never brought notes, only his memory. It seemed to be enough. Thomas Mann's account of the history of the Jews, Joseph and his brothers, begins so very beautifully with what I've always understood to be somehow a clue to Rykwert's memory. Thomas Mann writes on page 1, "Very deep is the well of the past. Should we not call it bottomless? For the deeper we sound, the further down into the lower world of the past we probe and press, the more do we find that the earliest foundations of humanity, its history and culture, reveal themselves to be unfathomable." So too for Joseph's memory. As a teacher, however, he was at his very best in conversations outside that room. Maybe his club, his flat, an exhibition opening. I mean, one-on-one conversations, which he never called supervisions, as did his professional colleagues. But the person I'd come to know thus, in camera, became very different when standing behind the lectern in front of an audience. He realized that too. Standing on Tottenham Court Road one night, waiting for his taxi after he'd given a lecture here at AA, he asked me what I thought of the talk. Not ready to address matters of content, still adrift in his ideas, I shifted to matters of form and remarked on the nervousness I thought I saw. I don't remember exactly what he said, but the meaning is this: when that friendly foe disappears, I'll look for another line of work. In lectures, he seemed to rush through his slides, observations a little bit too anecdotal, narratives somewhat choppy, what I suppose Aristotle meant by plots that are episodic. It wasn't for lack of practice. Once I heard him introduced as the person who had lectured at every major architecture school in the world. It may be true. The third form of teaching, seminars, was different again. Though fascinating and memorable, those round-the-table discussions were difficult, not only the ones in the Royal Academy Photo Lab, but also much later in the Rare Books Room at the University of Pennsylvania Art and Architecture Library, where he taught an equivalent course to the one I'd taken. It was at Penn called Readings. My fall course at Penn, its companion, was called Theories. The spring version of the course was taught by Marco Frescari. One expects teachers to teach by talking. Joseph, by contrast, taught by silence. He'd pose a question in just a few words, or ask for an interpretation of a page or passage one of us had just read, and then wait for the answer. And then wait still longer. As time passed, the hesitations and self-doubt behind the downcast eyes that ringed the table steadily increased, eyes with no escape. Still he waited. Until finally, thankfully, someone summoned the courage to risk a reply. And only then did he open the gate to the garden of his thought, memory, and all those references. He once described himself to me as a butterfly who liked to briefly alight on one flower, then move on to the next. First came reading, then explication. In a discussion or an advisory meeting, he would frequently ask me, "Does the name, let's say, Pierre Pot, mean anything to you?" When I confessed no, he gave me the correct spelling. You see it here in my notebook. Gave me the book title, plus an explanatory sketch, just enough push to get the boat off the dock. My job was to take hold of the rudder and fill the sails. We must always say what we see, so Le Corbusier asserted in 1956, 3 years after he received his RIBA Gold Medal, 58 years before Joseph received his. That first command was followed by a second that's even more challenging. Above all, and more difficult, we must always see what we see. Applying the first requirement to teaching and learning architecture, one can say that practices that have become rather common today should actually be avoided, glossing what others have said and illustrating what others have seen. Corbusier's second injunction gives education its proper subject matter, quote, above all, and more difficult, we must always see what we see. What's the difficulty here? The world's what we see, and what we see is the world, obviously. But if observation is not only association, and description not only citation, the tasks are not so simple. Saying what hasn't been said and seeing anew for oneself, that seems to be the real challenge. Close reading is a term I've used a few times in these recollections. I've had in mind the close study of text in buildings, reading slowly, repeatedly, and with attention to things that are unexpected. It's a practice that Joseph urged and demonstrated, and what seems to me to be particularly important in our time, when writing about architecture with what might be called eyes wide shut, has become the norm, together with the subordination of direct experience to erudition. My own attempts to say what I see and see what I see have been buttressed by others too. Abby Warburg, to whom I've referred, also the writer whose endorsement of close reading Joseph used as an epigraph for his short paper on hermeneutics. That's to say, James Joyce. The line from Ulysses is as follows, if you can't read it from the distance, quote, sounds a bit silly till you look into it well. The line follows a half-sentence description of a typesetter reading lines of type backward, as did Bloom's father with his finger. Joyce's phrase, look into it well, suggests the theme and report announced in Joseph's title on first hearing about hermeneutics. The little boy on the left is not Joseph, but it could have been. From the start, he makes it plain that the interpretive practice was not something he learned at school, but habituated as a youth at his uncle's knee. Reading this way, not so much backward or forward, but seeing what isn't directly visible, allowed him to grasp content that was indeed strange, but not altogether alien, which is what I tried to explain a few minutes ago about my first encounter, directed by him, with Lodoli's window still. Something peculiar, puzzling, and at the same time, world-opening. The essay's short story narrates two interpretations that converge. One of a synagogue courtyard dance that seemed to young Joseph both archaic and primitive, and another of a song about a schoolboy, his teacher, and an unexpected visitor to the classroom. A conflict of interpretations unfolds, and Joseph favors what was implied by the visitor's appearance, not what ostensibly occurred. After all, poetry is truer than history. One of the most eloquent and instructive lines from the text ends with an incomplete phrase. Quote, of course, this is quoting Joseph, of course the peasant lad had come to the yeshiva looking for a tailor to patch his breeches or whatever. And yet, the and yet is what I take to be the key in the story, also in hermeneutics and in my professor's way of teaching. Joseph continues, the whole world may well be a succession of theophanies, if only one knows how to look for them, how to pull the alien and obtuse words into one's own orbit. Knowing perfectly well the gravitational pull of his manner, memory, and insight, but despite it, Joseph the teacher expected each of his students to pull alien and obtuse words and worlds into their own orbits. For that lesson, I'm much in his debt and remained grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Very beautiful. I was reminded of when Joseph received the RIBA Gold Medal, and he spoke about his great admiration for W.R. Letheby.
Yes.
As a, I think perhaps partly in order to tell the story about how W.R. Letheby turned down the RIBA Gold Medal when he was offered it. But I wondered if you had a sense of were there particular figures who were models as teachers for Joseph's teaching? That I mean, he obviously encountered charismatic teachers like Albert Richardson during his time at the Bartlett, but were there specific figures that he ever referenced as sort of he either as models or anti-models for the kind of teacher he was?
I can't answer you directly. I would recommend everyone, if they haven't read it yet, read Remembering Places. He goes through a lot of people that inspired him, friendships, people he knew at a distance. And the other thing I'd say is that Joseph was different. He taught in different ways and became a different person in those several ways. It's almost like the title of his book, Remembering Places. It's actually people belong to places and what they do in those places. And the Joseph giving lectures, I don't think he enjoyed it, actually. I think he enjoyed working one, two. And the seminar was fine, but I think it's a different person in each circumstance. And I think perhaps a different model or somebody he recalled. And then the third comment I'd make is that, in truth, Joseph never spoke much about teaching. He spoke about subject matter and things and concepts embedded in things. And about his vocation, I can't remember him saying much. He just did what he did.
If there are any questions on the floor, we just have a little bit of time. If not, David, thank you so much. The next... I think our next contribution is on film. Robert Taverner has recorded a contribution, which Bob was obviously architectural historian and urbanist, and noted Alberti scholar, and undertook his Cambridge PhD on Alberti, which was supervised by Joseph. And later, he was co-editor of Body and Building, framing essays with an appreciation of Joseph's influence. Press go, I guess.
Good morning. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak at the symposium in honour of Joseph today. I regret my presentation had to be pre-recorded, but I'd already committed to join a trip to Southeast Asia before the symposium was planned. My thanks to Harriet Jennings and Molly Evans at the AA and all their colleagues for facilitating this recording. And to Marina Engel for the initial invitation. Thank you, Marina. It was proposed that my talk should focus on the 15th century Italian Renaissance intellectual and architect Leone Battista Alberti. This makes good sense. Alberti was a key historic figure in Joseph's own intellectual life, and I shared his passion through a long and rich working relationship. This began when I attended his Centre for Advanced Studies in Architecture course, the CASA course, held in the Library of the Royal Academy of Arts on London's Piccadilly in the autumn of 1977. The course comprised a series of seminars held on Wednesdays and ran across 2 academic terms as an elective for 6 students from the Polytechnic of Central London, School of Architecture now part of the University of Westminster, and 2 of Joseph's Essex University and Phil students. Joseph led the morning seminar, Dalibor Vesely the afternoon session. Joseph's seminars progressed from close studies of Vitruvius's treatise on architecture with references back to Greek antiquity, forward to the treatises by Leon Battista Alberti and Palladio. Sorry, I'm having a few technical difficulties here. As reinterpretations of Vitruvius in 15th, 16th century Italy. Joseph placed great emphasis on the need to address primary sources, what the architects wrote themselves, though we also reviewed the writings of leading scholars. Historical context was provided by seminars on St. Augustine and Abbot Suger of Saint-Denis, among others. Joseph's course culminated with Marc-Antoine Laugier and the French Enlightenment. Dalibor Vesley's afternoon sessions examined Enlightenment texts and related philosophers. Dalibor was supported by specialist philosophy lecturers as necessary. When I commenced the Casa course in autumn 1977, Joseph had begun guest editing a double edition of the magazine Architectural Design as a monograph on Alberti. Early in the course, Joseph asked who among us would be interested to work with him on a restoration of Alberti's incomplete church of San Sebastiano in Mantua for this monograph. As is often said, fortune favours the brave, and I've been forever grateful my hand shot up first, because the door then opened for me on an extraordinary and exhilarating new world, and I was fortunate to enjoy a very privileged and close pupil-master relationship with Joseph that endured throughout my subsequent career. Now the image, which is up too soon. This is an image of the San Sebastiano on the right, which Joseph very kindly wrote with me to help me through it, and the magazine cover on the left. On graduating in 1979, I took up the one-year Rome scholarship, studying Roman and Renaissance architecture in situ, during which time Joseph moved camp from Essex University to Cambridge. On my return from Rome, I was accepted at Cambridge and began research for a PhD under Joseph's supervision. My thesis focused on Alberti's definition of concinitas, using the classical Latin pronunciation, the notion of beauty in his theory and practice of architecture. As my thesis was being concluded, we considered what might come next. Portrait of Alberti, and it shows in rather wonderful Roman silhouette his head. As I say, it's a self-portrait. And on the left-hand side is his symbol, the flying eye. You can see it more clearly there on the left on a medal, but that the architect Matteo de Pasti produced. Underneath is the Latin motto he used, quid tum, what then, what now, what next? And that was the same for us, what next? Thoughts turned to a new English translation of Alberti's architectural treatise from the Latin, a project that Joseph contemplated as a young man. In his memoir, Remembering Places, he says he first considered taking on that task while working at Ovar's Charlotte Street office in his early 20s. Nearby was the bookshop of publisher, bookseller Alec Taranti, which he often frequented. And during one of their conversations, Taranti asked Joseph whether he would consider editing the existing 18th century English translation by Giacomo Leone of Alberti's 10 books on architecture. Joseph agreed, but as he laments in the foreword to his new 1955 edition, Leone's work had considerable flaws. As he puts it, it was flaccid, wigified, and not quite Augustan in prose. Misses the sharp definition and classical roundness of the original. Having alerted his readers to the shortcoming of Leone's translation, he believed that this flawed classic was worthwhile reissuing, as it was, and I quote him again from the foreword, still the only accessible source for the doctrine of the great Quattrocento master, whose teachings has become increasingly relevant in the last few years. Although relevance was a word he pointedly avoided when I knew him, Joseph was aware in the early 1950s of architects, and I quote, searching for a rationale for an expressive method, a search, he says, prompted by Le Corbusier's invention of the modular, which has now progressed further in issues long forgotten, such as the language of symbolic form in architecture, to arouse a new and urgent interest. He concludes that for the younger generation of architects, there is much in this book which will appear not only stimulating, but even directly relevant. Joseph concludes the foreword to his Leone by thanking Rudolf Virchow for his advice. Virchow, professor at the Warburg Institute from 1934 to 56, had entranced the young Rykwert, as Joseph relates in his memoir, while a schoolboy at Charterhouse. Joseph's adult re-engagement with Virchow likely came through Colin Rowe, whose MA thesis on Inigo Jones Virchow was supervising at the Warburg. Joseph had befriended Rowe after reading The Mathematics of the Ideal Villa, which was published in the Architectural Review in 1947. Rowe's essay famously drew comparisons between the architectural principles of Palladio and Le Corbusier, read through Virchow's architectural principles in the Age of Humanism and Corb's Towards a New Architecture. Virchow's architectural principles in the Age of Humanism was concerned to eliminate the architectural principles at the time of the Renaissance. It wasn't published by the Warburg Institute until 1949, but Rowe was familiar with these principles as a pupil of Virchow. The principles Virchow described were those set out by Alberti in his treatise and derived from perfection found in nature and natural order, as represented by and embodied within human form, pure geometry, a circle and square, sacred number, and musical proportion, which Alberti had filtered through his reading of key ancient texts, particularly Vitruvius. Having established the primary principles, Virchow illustrates their application to Alberti's buildings, and subsequently those of Bramante and Palladio. Virchow explains that architecture was regarded by Renaissance architects as a mathematical science which worked with spatial units. For the men of the Renaissance, this architecture, with its strict geometry, the equipoise of its harmonic order, its formal serenity, and above all, with the sphere and dome, echoed and at the same time revealed the perfection, omnipotence, and goodness of God. So this is illustrating Virchow's 1949 Warburg edition on the left and Joseph's 1955 edition with his comments on the right-hand side. The principles that Virchow outlines are rather beautifully and famously put together here, synthesized by Leonardo da Vinci, of man in circle and square, the body itself divided into units through linear divisions, the idea of human natural perfection in relation to geometry and the laws of the universe. Alberti had, before obviously Leonardo, looked at these issues himself on the left in his Tabulae Dimensionem Hominis, the dimensions, a table of dimensions of human proportions, codifying Brunelleschi's perspective at center and at right, the use of measuring devices, a disc and a rod, with plumb lines to measure sculptures and across human form as well. So there was a very definite knowledge how this should all be put together and then translated to architecture by him. Rowe had studied architecture at Liverpool before moving to the Warburg and had already described the continuity and relevance of these architectural principles to the younger generation of architects that Joseph wished to address through his new edition of Leone. Le Corbusier was, of course, there principal touchstone, whose architectural publications were as well known to that generation as his building designs. In Towards a New Architecture, Korb clearly identifies the principles that guided him, and in relation to regulating lines, state that architecture is the first manifestation of man creating his own universe, creating it in the image of nature, submitting to the laws of nature, which govern our own nature and universe. Korb describes regulating lines as one of the decisive moments of inspiration. It is one of the vital operations of architecture. He illustrates this by reference to the geometric lines set out on the ancient marble slab of the facade of the Arsenal Piraeus. The continuity of these principles is illustrated by Korb by his geometric overlays on elevational photographs of recognizably beautiful buildings and on his own building designs. Vickover also uses the geometry of the square to show how the facade of Santa Maria Novella by Alberti may be subdivided. He was not using very accurate surveys. And on the right, Colin Rowe, and on the right, Vickover shows Palladio's plans with the number systems that he describes annotated on them. Colin Rowe looks at the form and plans and makes direct comparisons between Palladio's Villa Rotunda and the Villa Savoie, amongst other buildings, Villa Stein, and so on. Showing a similar attitude to principles between the two great architects. The combined writings and drawings of Korb, the world-famous architect, and Vickover, the renowned scholar of architecture, had a powerful impact on an international audience in search of post-World War II principles. They inspired two major conferences, the first in Milan in 1951, at the First International Congress on Proportion of the Arts, entitled De Divina Proportione, to promote the use of proportional system in the arts, as they said, for the aesthetic and spiritual betterment of society. Both men attended to great acclaim. A rebuttal conference, actually a debate, was held at the RIBA in June 1957, framed by a motion derived from a statement attributed to Albert Einstein by Korb in Modular 2 as a scientist's response to the first modular. And he quotes that systems of proportion make good design easier and bad design more difficult. The debate by architects and historians went against the motion. Vickover was present. Whether or not Joseph had misjudged the mood of young British architects, he remained committed to Vickover's interpretation of Renaissance architectural principles. 2 decades later, his seminars on the Casa course and our subsequent work together drew heavily on that foundation. A good parallel text, Latin Modern Italian edition of Alberti's treatise by Giovanni Orlandi, had been published in 1966, and I had relied on it for my PhD thesis. Aware that Joseph wanted to improve on the Leone edition, I suggested that this was something we might somehow remedy together. But Joseph already had considerable demands on his time, and my Latin was not up to the task. So I asked Neil Leach, an architecture undergraduate student I was supervising at Cambridge, and who had demonstrated proficiency in Latin, whether he would produce the initial Latin-English translation under Joseph's supervision. Joseph agreed to this, and the MIT Press provided an advance that enabled Neil to start. Joseph asked me to review their progress against the Orlandi Latin-Italian edition and help find Alberti's voice in the translation, that sharp definition and classical roundness absent from Leone. I also prepared the glossary of terms based on my doctoral research. While this was underway, Joseph and I wrote an essay for the Architects Journal, Masters of Building Series, on St. Andrea Mantua, published in 1986, which was drawn directly from my PhD research completed the previous year. The images here from that journal are beautifully photographed by Martin Charles, the elevational drawing, and indeed the section through by Chris Bierman, who went on to become a partner at Allies and Morrison. The New English translation of Alberti's De Re Edificatoria was published by MIT in 1988. So another quid term, what next, which was to organize an exhibition on Alberti. By the late 1980s, we had enough new material on Alberti's architectural theory and practice to propose an exhibition, and our conversations gained momentum and increased in ambition when Joseph convinced Olivetti to fund the exhibition. Suitable exhibition space was explored in Italy, and as our ambitions for the exhibition grew, so did the space required. I took up a lectureship in architecture at the University of Bath in the late 80s, and so Joseph and I established the Alberti Group circa 1989-90 in a rented studio in central Bath. By then, Joseph had moved to the University of Pennsylvania, while retaining his London home. Funded by Olivetti, the Alberti Group engaged architecture students from Bath and Penn to produce large drawings of Alberti's buildings. They were impressive, but didn't have the visual impact required for a major exhibition. Olivetti liked where we were heading and increased their financial commitment and provided us with powerful state-of-the-art computers, part of their sadly failed attempt to move on from the typewriters for which they long admired. We took on full-time staff, mainly former Bath architecture students who knew how to use the computers, and produced 3D constructions of buildings and paintings, 15th century urban contexts and fly-throughs, as well as to digitally guide the latest computer model cutting machines. These physical models were built in Italy by the renowned model maker and restorer Felice Ragazzo, who lived up to his name. Happy he was and highly skilled. Felice had been a restorer of Brunelleschi's lime wood model for the Dome of Florence Cathedral. The models for the exhibition were also built in lime wood, and some were huge, particularly that of Alberti's Tempio Malatestiano, which was the size of a Fiat 500 car. The exhibition in the spacious former stables of Palazzo Te was opened in the spring of '94 by the President of the Republic, who arrived in Mantua in an impressive cavalcade. It was quite a spectacle, but Joseph was very put out by the local Italian dignitaries who flocked around the president and elbowed him out of the way, relegating him to a more distant secondary group, leaving the president to tour the exhibition with the uninitiated. We had photogrammetric surveys made of Alberti's buildings, which allowed precise judgments to be reached about the use of geometry and proportion, as illustrated here for Santa Maria Novella. So Vicova was clearly not deviating from what turned out to be fact. We looked at the urban layouts, the urban ensemble of Giovanni Rucellai, his church facade, his palace and loggia and piazza in front of the Palazzo Rucellai, and this wonderful little tomb, effectively, that was built to put his Giovanni's or lay Giovanni Rucellai's body at rest in. The text that runs around the top, inscribed on the frieze, taken from the Bible, is clearly designed by Alberti along with everything else. And Prue Charles made a rubbing of this. And you can see the wooden model at centre and the Rykwert sepulchre, as it's referred to in its setting on the left and around the model. Prue Charles's rubbings, she became a professor at Sheffield University, is illustrated here. We've got the whole frieze, which is rather wonderful at the actual size, of course. The idea of lettering was codified to an extent by Luca Pacioli in his text, the Divina Proporzione, again using square circular geometry, and you can see how the letters are configured. The rubbing showed that Alberti's lettering top, compared to Pacioli's below, was simpler, I think more elegant and refined, but again uses similar geometry to define the serifs and so on, and to create the radii of the curves. We used that, in a sense, created our own alphabet with his lettering for the various components of the exhibition, including this invitation from the President of the Republic. The exhibition itself is illustrated here. You can get a sense from the left-hand slide first, moving forward into the right-hand side, how it was set out with a lot of information provided by Joseph and Anne and his wife to provide a context, a cultural and historical context. And then on the right-hand side of each image are the models, the wooden models that Felice Ragazzo constructed using the photogrammetry surveys and our reconstructions. And you can see they're quite large. On the right is the left-hand slide of San Sebastiano in section, and the Annunziata in Florence, and in the distance Sant'Andrea, which you can see on the right-hand side more clearly. The animations then provided fly-throughs, which put these buildings in context, a physical context, in addition to the historical, cultural one that the images and paintings showed in a more conventional way, culminating in that run on the left-hand side there with a small physical model of central Mantua and a journey through the church itself. On the right is this Tempio Malatestiano model, which I say is about the size of a Fiat 500, and full-size details of mouldings on the right-hand side. And again, on the right to the right of that, an animation showing how the reconstruction had been arrived at in relation to the existing remains of the building. The catalogue, curated by Joseph and Anne, was produced as a very comprehensive document, and is a really a go-to document on that subject. I over the next period, did produce my own monograph on Alberti for Yale University Press called On Alberti and the Art of Building. The use of computers and animations in an exhibition have also become more commonplace since the early 1990s, when our exhibition opened. But at that time in '94, academics, scholars were being more skeptical about their value than they are now. But for us, it was important to convey the process, the design process that Alberti went through, what he was drawing from in each of the places that he designed, and why they're so different. In Mantua to Rimini, where there is the arch of Roman arch, which gets interpreted by Alberti for his facade, or indeed in Florence with the Rykwert sepulchre, which is based on, as Giovanni Rucellai says, the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem itself, in which he derived from a survey of dimensions. So each building, each place had a different starting point, but of course overlaid onto that were these architectural principles that Bitkover talks so well about. They were the same, obviously, to an extent that Korb used, although that was perhaps more of a universal approach to architecture, less place-related. The publication of my monograph really brought 2 decades of collaborative work on Alberti to a conclusion. And I guess my parting shot in relation to this was then as being part of the Festschrift, which was held on Joseph's 70th birthday, so in 1996, so almost 30 years ago. A younger version of me on the left 30 years ago. Joseph hardly ever changed, I think, all the time I knew him. But 30 years on, I'm now the same age as him there. And so we go on. On the right-hand side is the Body and Building Festschrift that George Dodds and I co-edited, and which contains essays by Joseph's architect friends, colleagues, scholars, and former students. It was a good end to that collaboration. The Dancing Column, Order and Architecture, had been published earlier that year. So we were celebrating that as well as his 70th birthday. So, to end, and obviously there'll be a lot more discussion as the day goes on, and I'm sorry to be missing it, but I'd just like to say thank you in a way. Joseph generously continued to support my academic career, and we lectured and taught together subsequently. He was an exceptional man who enriched many of our lives, and I'm very grateful he took me on part of his long Alberti journey. The character of our collaboration was not something we ever discussed. Certainly I could never match his profound, almost encyclopedic knowledge, diverse cultural experience, and linguistic skills. But I had a strong interest in the architectural design process, how buildings were conceived and made, and how architectural theory relates to practice, and lots of enthusiasm. Anyway, it was a fruitful relationship, and one, of course, that I will always treasure. So thank you for permitting me to make this tribute to Joseph, and I look forward to hearing how the day goes. Thank you very much.
Next up, we have Eric Parry. Eric was studied at the University of Newcastle and completed his diploma here at the Architectural Association, where he studied under Dalibor Vesely, I think graduating in 1980, and subsequently went on to become a central figure at the Cambridge School of Architecture during the period when Joseph was teaching there in the 1980s. Eric's office, of course, was renowned for housing at the for Pembroke College in Cambridge, for the extension of the Holborn Museum in Bath, and a succession of very innovative office developments across the City of London and at King's Cross. Eric Parry.
Thank you, Alice, and thank you, Marina, for this invitation. After both David and Robert, I will bring us at least closer to the pavement, I think, in this, and to a number of anecdotes and encounters. The first, actually, is that I reflected on this morning was the wave of influence coming from the Essex course, particularly, which I encountered as a draftsman working part-time for an architect, Douglas Cleland, in whose office, I think probably in the summer of 1974, as a fly on the wall on my drawing board, was surprised at least to listen to the group who arrived in the office to discuss nothing less than sort of revolutionary change that they perceived in architecture to various schools taking different positions, not least the AA, but also PCL. But amongst the number were Dalibor Vézelay, Danny Libeskind, Alberto Perez Gomez, Don Janassi, and it was extraordinary, actually. I then left for a year on some voyaging, and I came back. I hope I've got this right. Really, yeah. I became a student at the Royal College of Art, following a kind of ditching of architecture and spending a year at a foundation course at Hornsey College of Art. I remember at the college passing a door that was the librarian's, where J. Rykwert was still there, although he'd obviously moved on to Essex. And at the same time, I was living a fairly precarious life, actually in the Roundhouse car park in a bus, and night guarding at the Serpentine Gallery, which was an important source of funding. So I think that at that time, this list on the right is a kind of an amazing one, because the night guarding at the Serpentine Gallery had started as a consequence of meeting dressed for my night guarding duties with my cap of vigilance and loyalty, Sue Grayson, who said, "Oh, well, I'm looking for a night guard." So for many years, I fulfilled that role. And this sort of bounces around. Obviously, Dawn edited this amazing catalogue for the exhibition that was Dada and Surrealism Reviewed, comes to mind now simply because Richard Francis, who is mentioned there, it's a sort of period of the Arts Council in its heyday, had asked if, knowing that I knew him through his sister being a very close friend, and asked if the students at the college would be interested in designing the exhibition, which I thought was a great idea. I took to my professor, John Miller, and I think very wisely it became his commission. And if I remember correctly, the catalogue came quite late. I mean, it's amazing to think that this extraordinary exhibition at the Hayward was only on for 3 months or thereabouts. But yeah, my night guarding duties included the setting up of the Henry Moore and witnessing Henry Moore ticking off David Sylvester for the incorrect positioning of his sculptures, and indeed coming to knock on the window to ask me to help him move a couple of Giacomettis after he'd had a hernia operation. And I had many visitors, including Joseph, actually, because at this time we were doing some work together on improvements to one of the gateways to Jerusalem. It's a story I'll come to. Nonetheless, I think the terms of reference here to these two catalogues and to a period of life which was really very interesting, led back through, whilst at the Royal College, also the name Dalibor Vézelay emerged again in some extraordinarily good lectures that Kenneth Frampton gave about the European city, in which he quoted Dalibor a number of times. And jumping right to now, as it were, Owen Hathley has recently published, I think, a remarkable book called The Alienation Effect, that is a long overdue recognition of the incredible impact that these figures of emigres from the terrifying kind of politics of Europe at the time had on the cultural life of this country. There are many among them, but on the right-hand side, I'm just reminded of, and Owen starts the book with the juxtaposition of the Palace of Westminster on one side of the Thames, and on the south, St. Thomas's Hospital by YRM, which is clearly influenced by this remarkable work by Havlicek and Honzig, the pensions building in Prague. This is the special edition about that for the third in 3 volumes of MSA, the architectural magazine of the period 1931 or so. The other, so this reminded me in terms of writing the citation for Joseph's, thank you very much, Ellis, for Joseph's Gold Medal. Just the reading from and talking to Joseph before this, I quoted that, the political context of your youth could not have been more different. Warsaw to the Europe we know, relatively stable at least. This was a few years ago. Warsaw was the epicenter of the growing political storm in the 1930s, with a maternal lineage referencing pre-revolutionary Russia as a cultural precedent, and an Anglophile father. You vividly remember your family's nervous laughter at the menacingly comical broadcasts of one Adolf Hitler, and at the same time the living terror experienced at first hand by your father of communist Russia. The book, The Alienation Effect, places the Naum Galbo's sculpture that is part of St. Thomas's and the Havlicek and Honzig reference as a beginning, and actually it then turns to more of the Hampstead world of others, like a little-known painter called Hans Freibusch, and he had made a lot of commissions. He was part of the Degenerates, so shown next to Beckmann and others, and then had arrived in earlier than Joseph in 1933. The book ends actually with his murals in Newport, which are quite remarkable, that I've recently gone to see, assisted by one Phyllis Bray, a painter who it turns out, as another chance encounter, I discovered was the cousin of my art teacher, who did all the frameworks for those sculptures, and she and Freibusch worked for 3 years on those, living together on the Wye Valley. But he'd also been the artist for the Festival of Britain Church, which I came to really revive, as well, around his amazing crucifixion with its extraordinary colours. The world for me then, subsequent to the RCA, became my connection here at the AA for 1 year, in fact. So having done 2 years at the Royal College, without its recognition then, the Department of Environmental Design on one side of the great Cadbury Brown building, the other being environmental media. That took a course of 2 years, and then the 1 year here was granted me in order to get my Part 2. And that was a remarkable moment. So that was 1978. This is the outcome a couple of years later of the Unit 1 run by Dalibor Vesely and Mohsen Mustafavi, with Homo Farjadi's most beautiful drawing of the threshold and portal as its cover. But the point was really that at the beginning of that year, the two books that were kind of commended and became incredibly important were Richard Sennett's The Fall of Public Man, and how wonderful to have Richard here, and then, of course, The Idea of a Town. So I think they're both published about the same time, around about 76, so they're like 2 years into their lives as books, and were incredibly profoundly important for me personally. I think the background also, I think, is very interesting to this. For me, again, another encounter on the right with Ernst Cassirer is his connection to Abbey Warburg in Hamburg, where I spent quite a lot of time, where the Bornplatz synagogue had been pulled down. But Cassirer was the first, if I'm not wrong, Jewish chancellor leading a German university back in the early 1920s. And it's extraordinary to think of their meeting there. Abbey Warburg, I believe, had done a deal with his brother, his younger brother, to take over the bank so that he could, his one condition was that he could buy any book he wanted. And so in 1933, again, as part of that extraordinary exodus and our benefit was the assimilation of the Warburg Institute here into London. On the left, of course, another figure that's so important to Joseph. I like that idea of being a wayward student, at the beginning of architecture, and in reference, in a way, to the search for origins that The Idea of a Town encapsulates in a more anthropological way. I think for Joseph, the connection with the Warburg was not just fellow students, I believe, like Francis Yates, but also the extraordinary world around the university, and particularly anthropologists like Mary Douglas. So there's something that Joseph is adding in a very profound way to the journey. And of course, that brings me to On Adam's House as part of that. And I can see, thinking of Richard Sennett's subsequent journey from the mid-70s and Joseph, it was almost like a crossing of rivers, where either Richard's work has come closer to the focus from the city to making, and we're talking now about the issues around quality in the environment, whilst Joseph's moved towards the city, from which much began. And following those anecdotes about meetings, there was a plan to, and indeed a submission was made about the city as an exhibition to the Hayward, to the Arts Council, which didn't get off the ground. But at this point, I think the Cambridge becomes a focus rather than London. And I well remember I was doing a little bit of part-time teaching at Cambridge, and an assistant lectureship came up, and I gave Joseph a lift back from Cambridge, and I asked him whether he thought it would be worth my while applying. And after a pause, he said, well, yes, but as long as you don't mind them rejecting you. At which point, my beaten up Mini Minor hit a bump and the bonnet flew up. And actually, I think Joseph is a very superstitious guy. You know, he was. You could mention certainly. I won't now. Certain figures, and you know, the conversation would cease very instantly. But as I've mentioned, I did get that job actually, and at the same time I've mentioned the work we did as I was drafting for him for this little project in Jerusalem. And I went to see him, and actually the first thing that I found was he was designing. It was interesting talking about typography earlier, that he was designing his mother's headstone. And I was very struck by that, and it was very moving with Marina to open up the plan chest and find that drawing and his care and attention to the lettering. In any case, he gave me this copy of Emilio Ambas's wonderful MoMA catalogue as a result of the work I did with him. So that's it on the left-hand side as a thanks, I think. And on the right is an inscribed book from 84 of Nadja from Dalibor Vesely. I owe them both huge amounts to their generosity. It then moves, I guess, to Joseph's work that I've alluded to, thinking more broadly, which I've found incredibly important. So in The Seduction of Place of 2000 and the post-9/11 perspective that gave the writing a great immediacy, he, in two of the chapters, one on the suburbs and the new capitals, draws to light again, many people who perhaps had been overlooked, but one was certainly the extraordinary world of Tony Garnier and the Cité Industrielle, which was the result of a Prix de Rome, and a very you open these volumes and you see it's humbling to see, frankly, the depth and thinking about city making when we're faced where we are now with the so-called new town movements that are coming. That was one area of The Seduction of Place that I found incredibly instructive, and the other was in his deep-lying a kind of desire and a longing for New York, the heart of the city and the capital of the globe, in which I think it's a very eloquent, articulate chapter that manages to make accessible a very complex history. But it does throw light also on the Rockefeller Center and the importance of that in terms of city making. And then in the necessity of artifice, there was, again, another, it's an extraordinary achievement, I think, that he was the first person really to draw Eileen Gray's work to attention again. So I think Corbusier had written about her work back in the late 30s. And then Joseph turns up with the article about the two houses by Eileen Gray. I don't know whose photograph this is. It might be his. But it's a very moving kind of testimony to the everyday, I think, to shading, to the table, to the context. And he, I think, was given the introduction to Eileen Gray through his friendship with Prunella Clough. And I have to say that starting as I did with the Dawn Eddy's wonderful catalogue, and figures like Alan Bowness. Once I had got that lectureship and had been in Cambridge, I became a committee member at Kettle's Yard, and for many years. Michael Harrison actually was the person who put the cabinet of Henry Moore's maquettes together at a certain time, and he was the director at Kettle's Yard. And there was the Prunella Clough exhibition, I think in 1998, which was an incredible summary of her work. I remember her there. I was there at the opening after a committee meeting, and I purchased this painting, which was still virtually wet. So it was one of her last paintings, the most beautiful painting called In Half Light, a kind of homage to Braque. But also I can't help thinking to, her aunt, Eileen Gray. Thank you.
Eric, I was struck, you mentioned you were living on a bus in the Roundhouse car park, and which was, I guess, making me think about, you must have had first-hand experience of the kind of the counterculture in London, and I'd just be interested to hear you talk a little about the relationship between this kind of world of historic inquiry that you've been describing and the architectural politics of that period in an institution like this, perhaps. I guess we had a moment particularly in the 70s when a city like Milton Keynes is being developed, when there's kind of a lot of skepticism about the possibilities of modern architecture to represent cultural identity still. Could you talk a little about, make it a bit more explicit, perhaps, the kind of why history specifically at that moment felt like a useful route for finding a way out of what was perhaps an impasse for modern architecture?
Yeah, I think it's interesting in terms of the schools of architecture. They come through their, the teaching staff principally to follow, I think, certain trends. So it was true, if I think about the PCL as it was a pretty strict, generally, kind of modernist line that was being trodden until the arrival of some of those some of those people I mentioned, you know, who really stirred it up, Danny, Alberto, and so on. So that was perhaps where the PCL was. The AA obviously was moving through a period of change with Alvin. I was aware of its former guise a bit, not least because I came for an interview here on the very day that the motion was being rejected of its amalgamation to imperial. That's my first year, before my first, and as a result of that, the anarchy and the amazing sort of sense and pulse in this room, found myself in Newcastle. But the AA then represented, by this time, 78, an extraordinary flowering of variety of, you know, if I think of Dalabor's unit, Rem was here, it was his last year, teaching, Zaha, of course, and Peter Wilson, many others. So this was a place that was full of the world of possibilities. By the way, nothing to do with construction, everything to do with city making. It was about the city. Alvin had brought that, and so and at the same time, yes, the Roundhouse was, for instance, a really interesting territory. So I guess night guarding the Roundhouse existence, I was close to the street. And I didn't mention, actually, in thinking about that city exhibition at the Hayward, we did, it's a year or two later, we did have a kind of initiation rite on the top of a squat I was in at that point in Lisson Grove with Joseph. And that was an extraordinary thing, you know, that actually was performative. There was a world of performance, and I think we forget performance has become very much part of the mainstream. We should think of Marina Abramovitz and so on. It was, I think the street was very active, very live, and interesting, as you ask.
And at a time when the city was being rediscovered reclaimed by a new generation, I guess from the late from 1966 onwards, perhaps. And in a way that feels like the move away from kind of comprehensive redevelopment towards the reclamation of existing buildings, that all feels of a part with the kind of work that Joseph was making.
We deviate, but the Tolma Square kind of resistance was very much part of that world, for instance, and the result you can see, unfortunately.
Anyone from the floor? Richard.
Thank you for this, memories. They stirred in me and I was thinking about this before I came, what Joseph's legacy would be to people your age. You know, why does this matter now, this work? And in parts, I think Eric's touched on it, but it needs to be reinforced. Joseph had a very complicated relationship to the material world. He was a materialist, not a Marxist, but he was a materialist very much. The reason he built these models was that he thought that you learn much more by looking at a model than looking at a drawing. He had very ambivalent sense of drawing on screen with CAD, but he loved the beginnings, even though they were very crude, of 3D printing, because you had something again that you could see. And that's reflected in your work and your sense of sort of material quality of things. But the other side for Joseph, and this was a man of books and of essentially images as a reference to something else. And there's a real tension in his work. That huge library that you see was something that I knew him for 40 years. That, he'd stare at these images and you say, well, what are you thinking about? And he said, oh, I'm thinking about something that I read in Meyer Shapiro, about something completely different. So this was a kind of the relation between words, criticism, and so on, was in tension with this materialism. But I think in books like The Dancing Column, books on the Adam's House in Paradise, these are books that are attempt to recover the kind of materiality of practice. And I think when you read these books, I mean, they're quite different from our, because we have a different set of references for them. I hope that that's what comes through, that it's a kind of love of physical things. And that's why Eileen Gray was so important to him. And it's why when they made the Alberti exhibit, he was thrilled to make these models. Absolutely thrilled by this. He didn't want to put things up on the wall only. So that's sort of my thought about why we should be thinking about him today. That tension in him is a tension in us as well.
I'd just like to ask Eric and anyone, is it possible to see a course of development or evolution in Joseph's ideas of the motive for a town? I think the idea of a town was preceded, wasn't it, by an early essay that he did in Holland with Van Eyck, Sign for a Town, I think it's called. And then you go on to the Seduction of Place. So is there some sort of continuity one can, or has anybody attempted to trace this through? Because it's something to do with more than just diagrams of towns and schemes for returning to 19th century planning and so on. That's very much the kind of thing, the revision of urbanism that took place in the 70s around people like Rob Creer. Mm-hmm. And it's an attempt, from what I can see in Joseph's work, to find always a kind of primal motive for things. Why are you doing something? From what does the primary image of identification begin, whether it's the body in the column or the place and the motive, the idea of a town? Anybody want to pick that up?
I don't know whether this will join up, but this is the sort of dumb thing I would say to Eric on the street. So I think this is a room full of people of a certain age. And one of the things that haunts me is the T word, temporary. And a lot of what you were talking about was temporariness. And I was reminded that the tea house in Kensington Gardens, Royal Parks, when we had the Royal Parks, call Joanna Drew at the Hayward and say, we're very anxious. We think we might be squatted. Could you use this as a gallery?
Have I got any more hands? In that case, I think our next contribution is on film, but Eric, thank you very much.
Thank
indeed.
you.
next going to hear from Phyllis Lambert and Martin de Vletter about Joseph's archive, which is now at the Canadian Centre for Architecture.
So we're in the vaults of the CCA.
Hi.
Hello. And with some materials of Joseph's archive. I visited Joseph in 2019 in the summer to discuss the donation of his archive to the CCA. And it was around the same time, well, we had a lot of archives of architects already at the CCA, but we were discussing archives of scholars and writers and critics and their archives, and Joseph was one of them that we were starting to discuss it. And it was important to see the archive in London, where he lived, in his house, to see the context and have Joseph explaining all the different parts of his archive that reflects his writing and his teaching career, often overlapping, of course. And the material that we were looking at the time, the library was still intact, and we went back and forth between the library, the manuscripts, the many slides that he had, and photographs. And he was explaining the different pieces and how they connect. He was also at the same time already starting to organize or reorganize the archive for the transfer to the CCA and making sure that it would be understood by others. He would make notes on the back of photographs, for example, to tell us who is, for example, of people, that who is on the in the photographs. But the relationship between Joseph and the CCA goes back a long time. It starts with you, Phyllis.
Yeah, that was amazing, because in the very early times of the CCA, even before our building was being designed, we mounted an exhibition on the villas of Pliny with people. There had been one in Paris, and we brought it here because people needed, this information or these ideas, and we mounted it at the Museum of Fine Arts. Obviously, we didn't have a building, and I had read the Villas of Pliny, and so we invited Joseph to come for an event, a related event, on a symposium on classicism, and we got on very like house on fire, I should say. And very shortly after that, there was some discussion of our participating, the CCA participating in a module of his exhibition that he was planning on the Villas of Pliny. Well, although we didn't participate in the final exhibition, in fact, it was much later, correspondence and documents pertaining to it continue through 1985. So that's at least two years or more in my archives at the CCA, included our early drafts of the exhibition proposal, Joseph's lists of exhibitions and exhibits, and topics, the publication that was discussed with Victoria Newhouse, costs, all funding and all those technical issues, and my critical path outline, discussion about venues for the exhibition, and our correspondence on the subject ends in 1986 with a proposal by Joseph, which I annotated, for an Alberti exhibition to open on the 4th of January, 1986 at the Brera, Milan, but of course it never did. On some visits to London during this period, Joseph took me to dinner to the rarefied, steeped in history gentlemen's private clubs he belonged to. I think there were two of them, with the same Cheshire cat. Do you know? Smile. He drove me up the impressive ramp of the 6-story apartments, mixed of a mixed-use development in 1972 of the inner court, 48 Church Street, seen here in Joseph's photograph, and in the CCA Rykwert files. That is there. Joseph was the architectural design consultant to the two Covenant architects. Complexed, organized around a courtyard in a U plan, the central area incorporated offices and a carport. But it was a historic buildings report, which is very interesting how well it was considered. The inner court was touted as a good example of low-rise, medium-density, speculative housing project with the use of 45-degree angles and plan section. The report author also mentioned that the courtyard planning was developed at Cambridge School of Architecture, obviously further identifying Joseph as the architect of the project. As an architect, I am, of course, interested in how Joseph's work, how he passed from the work of the field to abandoning that, and to abandoning what in terms he called the modernist project, and its great promise, and easily drawn back. And he said, I was easily drawn back to the charms of the past, as Joseph wrote in his memoir, Remembering Places. He also continued, there was a dichotomy about the way I tried to yoke my two passions together. Maybe it was just about another of those pluralities to which I had become inured. Of the many visits that Joseph in London and Philadelphia and Italy, Joseph and Anne, his wife, of course, and I journeyed across India from Cochin to Madras. And we were joined by Rykwert's former student, the Australian architect, Lawrence Neild, and we only see his wife here. My archives hold the itinerary of this formidable and extraordinary 2-week journey that occurred after the Chandigarh conference for the 50 years of Chandigarh, in which we both were presenters.
Yeah, it's very interesting because I see a lot of overlap in the interest you have, and also, by the way, a lot of overlap in the actual archive. So let's say the evidence, the physical evidence of it, materials in your archive that overlap, photographs that overlap with Joseph's archives too. But also in terms of, let's say, interest, in terms of the sense of place, I think, in both your cases. The origin of architectural ideas very strongly in his writings, clearly. I don't know, his critique of the post-war, the kind of modernist post-war, I don't think you share the same critique, but it is, let's say, a subject I believe you discussed many times, yeah. But going back to the archive where we can find all of the evidence of these conversations you had, but also he had with many people, there's a lot of correspondence in the archive, which is fully processed and accessible now. There is the different manuscripts, also the manuscripts that were looked at by others, or he asked others to comment on. So the different versions of all these manuscripts, which I find interesting, of the idea of town, obviously, and also Adam's house in all its different stages, including the photographs that he wanted to be published with it, and his notes, which are very interesting. But as well as a very large and interesting photographic collection that he gave to us too, alongside the papers, a lot of slides, but also photographs that really, I think, show or give an insight in how he saw the world, and also how he wanted to write about architecture.
Yes, that's very interesting.
Okay, so our last session of the morning. We're going to have a table discussion with 4 old friends of Joseph's, and the 4 people we have. Could I invite up Javier Castanon, Homer Fajadi, Kenneth Frampton, and Frosso Pimenides, please? Have we got, yeah, grab a seat. Yeah, have we got Javier as well?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, thank you. Perhaps I think the easiest way we do this is if I ask everyone in turn just briefly describe how they came to know Joseph in the first place. What was the point of encounter?
Do I start?
Let's go round, yes.
Well, I'm Homa Farjadi. I was a student of Joseph's when I was doing my PhD, supposedly at the time, and started with the course in Essex, which Joseph thought was a very good net for a basic cover of what were the architectural ideas and historiographic material that everybody should know, no matter that my topic was pre-Islamic Zoroastrian architecture. So I'll tell you a little bit about it later, but maybe as we go on.
Kenneth.
Well, I wrote a little piece, which I won't read right now, but I first met Joseph here in King's Yard, which is a space that no longer exists. Soon after he came back from Milan, I think, where he worked for BPPR, above all, of course, Ernesto Rogers, but he was certainly influenced by Rogers, I think, in many ways. And, well, that's it. I first met him on that occasion. And I can't really remember exactly what is that occasion, what date.
We're talking mid-50s?
Yeah, right, yes, we
Okay.
are, yeah.
Frosso.
But the exact date,
Right, I'm Frosso Pimenidis. I've got a few little stories. I first met Joseph in '79. The only design tutor that taught me real design was Don Geneschi from Oregon, Italian origin. And he brought me over to say, look, you must go and do this Essex course. So I remember that I sat in the basement kitchen of Son Museum, and as a very annoying young Greek student, I was desperately trying to articulate ideas to him. I was petrified. I hated him. He made me feel really stupid. And I never felt so intimidated in my life. Well, yeah. Then years passed, and I was a professional, I was teaching, and we met with Anne, his beloved Anne, at the Rogues and Vagabonds, an alumni Bartlett annual do. And it was the year he got the gold medal. And then it was amazing, like in about 1 hour, we caught 20 years of silence. And I introduced him to my students, and then he started taking me seriously, slightly seriously. Of course, I did explain that my agenda of teaching and architecture was totally different to the amazing Essex course initial ideas. We had a splendid evening, so it was like condensed time within one evening. And for me, the most important thing is I was the spoiled one, because Marina was doing all the stuff from Rome over the last years after Anne passed away, and I was the spoiled one because we felt like family, that I was the spoiled, like she had to deal with all the serious matters, and I had the luxury of having a dad or a teacher that would tell me off, but in a way that you would listen, because we never listened to parents or teachers. So it was this amazing relationship of givingness, openness, criticism, and luxury. And every time I would go really depressed there from life, and I would leave amazing. And my penalty for always being late was that our Friday pasta dinners would not have basil that he would pick up from his front garden if I was late, and rarely we had basil. We'll go on to other stories later.
You need the microphone.
I'm Javier Castañón. I think that very few people will know me here, or unless you are professional students, because I'm still teaching here. So I met Joseph because I was his student when I was in my fourth year. And so I took his course in the fourth year and in the fifth year because I enjoyed him immensely. And I thought that he was the one that could actually, I don't know, bring you into the subject matter with such ease and so on. So, you know, I think I hit it off with him. He hit it off with me. And then there was a big gap as well. And then we, I mean, I could repeat stories that everybody here would actually have, very much the same thing. Perhaps the only thing that was different is that I was a neighbour of his. And we used to go to church on Sundays at the same time, in the same place. And then we would walk back up Fitzjohn's Avenue, quite slowly and relaxed. And then we would talk about all sorts of things. And we were very good friends. That was what everybody was. Very intimate, because we would talk about things that were very intimate. And when I look back, I said, well, I don't know if you talk about these things to other people, but they were, you know, very profound. And his conversion, his faith, all these things.
Thank you. Wonderful. Kenneth, I'm going to turn to you first. I'd like to come back to this question of what it means to be a historian, an architectural historian whose background is as a practitioner, and that one always thinks of, I guess most famously, the reverse sequencing of on Adam's House in Paradise, where each chapter is moving further and further back into history, and one but sense is always with Joseph's writing, the interest in history is ultimately about informing present practice. And this is very much the kind of your working method too. Could you talk a little about the extent to how you situated yourself, or you saw Joseph situating himself in relation to conventional art history?
Well, I find it somewhat difficult because I somehow fell into the game of, I studied here architecture at the A, and I first began to write, strange enough, as did, by the way, Rainer Banham and Theo Crosby. I don't think Joseph ever wrote for this strange publication called Art News. It was owned and run by somebody called Dr. Gainsborough. And I first wrote a piece of art criticism in that paper about an exhibition in Israel. And I think that's also odd about Banham and Crosby. Well, Crosby, of course, had been trained as an architect, but we all three of us started. The first writing was really art criticism and not about architecture at all. And so I don't really know how yes. Well, important in all this is the figure of Theo Crosby, and important for me. Well, it's Theo, of course, who plugs me into his position, being technical editor alongside Monica Pigeon of the magazine Architectural Design, and that was a great moment for me, and I of course I wrote now and then pieces in that magazine, but the main task was to come up with material for the magazine. I mean, of course, I worked with Monica Pigeon, who was the editor and who was a very lively and provocative person. But in many ways, I think she depended upon the so-called technical editor to come up with material. And in this regard, this brings me to Joseph, because Joseph and I suppose, he was a friend of mine, you know, from the very beginning. People talked earlier on this morning about his amazing smile, and it was an expression of his fundamental generosity as a person, I think, and his openness. He was completely without prejudice, this person, or relatively so, I would say, not prejudicial in any way whatsoever. And so he was a colleague and a friend. I already knew him beforehand on a very casual basis, but then I commissioned him to write two pieces for architectural design. The first of which was Giulio Carlo Argan's thesis on typology, and on the difference between type and model, which is a very complex thing, but I think we could say, you know, type was more generically conceived and model was more specific paradigm in relation to a particular architectural design or project problem. So that was a very influential article, translated into English and with a kind of interpretation and commentary by Joseph. So that was one moment which was very important to me. And the second one was, I can't remember now exactly how this came into being, but in any case it involved Joseph writing an article in AG, and I think one of the first appraisals in English anywhere, on Gino Valli. And that, well, Gino Valli in Udine, and who was, his father had been an architect, and now, of course, the practice still goes on with the son of Gino Valli. And yes, and it was important from another point of view, because I suppose my name has become irrevocably associated with critical regionalism, but I think, as everyone knows, the first the figures that formulated that term and were Alex Zonis and Leanne Lefebvre in an essay called "The Grid and the Pathway" of 1981. But I'm talking about, of course, 64, something like that, and so, you know, this slogan-like term, critical regionalism, has not ever been enunciated by anybody, and certainly not by me. But what the Joseph's piece on Valli in Udine set me off in a certain direction, and although I was never able to completely fulfill it, because rather stupidly, I think I renounced that position and went to the United States, and got lost in certain respects. And but the fascinating, yes, what sparked me off in a way, the Udine piece, the piece on Gino Valli in Udine, is I started to think about other architects who could have been similarly pursued in the magazine and really were not, because I left, basically. But just for example, there are sort of somewhat obscure figures today, like somebody, and we did publish his work, someone named Ernst Giesel in Zurich. I thought there was, yes, what I fantasized about, as opposed to Britain, where there's, you know, the provincial city doesn't have significance. It probably had more significance in the 19th century, but in the mid-20th century, I think provincial cities did not have cultural significance in a way. Not in terms of architectural culture, but maybe even more widely than that. So I started to think, you could say fantasize about the particular strong relationship between an architect and a provincial city. So between Gino Valli and Udine, between Oswald Matthias Ungers and Cologne, and between Ernst Giesel and Zurich, you know. And I suppose this eventually led to other similar kind of paradigms, such as Mario Botta in relation to Lugano, and so on. And so that is long before I happened to read. But I had, you know, I had at the same time, you know, for example, in relation to Greece, two figures, two posed figures in Athens, Aris Constantinides and Dimitri Pikionis, so that I began to look at what I thought were more intimate relations between architects and particular places, the kind of relations that were difficult to establish in this country because of the domination of London in a way, and it was hard to find parallels, you know. So Joseph was for these two moments. Joseph was very important to me, and we remained very close to each other for the rest of my life, and his, for that matter. Yes.
Homer, can I turn to you, and could you tell us a little about how you came to be a student of Joseph's in the first place?
Actually, it was very interesting because Robert Maxwell, who obviously was your colleague, generously pointed to me when I asked him about my interest and where I could be best taught. I was a student at the AA doing history and theory and housing, etc. And I was a student of Dalibor's in diploma school. But for pursuing PhDs, I was told to get in touch with Joseph. And Joseph was very generous and very welcoming. I never forget that here I was suggesting a topic which was so, in my view of it, was so far from his domain, his area of expertise in, let's say, Western architecture's concerns and theories. And yet he thought that pre-Islamic architecture, Zoroastrianism, may be interesting. Now, I was stunned that he would actually accept my topic, but never, and then I realized that here he was Joseph, who did not believe in these silos of architectural thinking, neither Western architecture, but even Western architecture was going back to places of myths and ritual objects, which were much more significant to what we do now. Even modern architecture was his interest, than what might be thought as, you know, the relevance of potential relevance of myths and ritual objects of Zoroastrian Persia. So he had me read a lot of anthropological texts, and I really found great insight that he opened the doors for me on reading these topics year after year in the British Museum, and you know, things which were really somewhere else from architecture that I daily practice or as a student of architecture. But it became quite important to understand his interest in this world, which I think Donna has referred to, this history of ideas, the role of anthropological texts, the way in which objects, which David referred to, became part of daily life, and where these daily life matter to us in the modern world, in the contemporary world. So it came to me when I read, for example, this little, which I find very lovely text on the sitting position,
Oh, amazing.
Yes.
Amazing. Unbelievable.
Really a very concise, short piece, but nevertheless such a big lesson for us, not only as students of history of architecture, but also as practitioners of architecture. What does it mean, he said, when every time you stand up, you reenact being birds? And this idea of sitting being associated with the original or the final return to the womb. So he had this idea of where things, these reenactments and performative, somebody else was actually talking about this notion of the performative, which became part of how we conceived architectural design, no matter at what time, at what age, and in where. So regionalism was important to him up to the point where it made specificity out of objects and design, but it became much more shared in its deep content. And so when I read among many other readings, of course, that as students of his we were following, what was very intriguing to me was when he's asking for modern architects not to just reenact the meaning of the original objects, which was unfortunately what a lot of people kind of, in my view, in a wrong-headed way, take him to mean, how to produce meaning in architecture by, arches and whatever. And he was asking for architecture to respond to emotions and to the potential, to bringing about the potential response to the unconscious. And that's why I think his interest with Dalibor Vesely, who was also my teacher in the studio, was so inspiring for us, because there was not only surrealism, but also the sort of general everyday acts like what Eric talks about in Living on the City, Kentish Town, things which were pretty everyday, became important in actually teaching or studying of producing of architecture. I mean, I would just stop there to say that I have learned consistently as a teacher of architecture now and a practitioner, how this becomes a very important part of the way we behave with response to where we find our emotions and our form-making operations can take us beyond what is sanctioned as either history or origin.
I think, I also, as I indicated, greatly admire this essay, and it also does two things at once. One is to make one aware of sort of the existential presence of a body and the way in which a baby, and also you could say Japanese, or for that matter Arab people, the body sits in itself and doesn't need a chair, and then Joseph, in this brilliant essay, does a number of things at once. First of all, it is a critique of reductive, so-called scientific positivism.
Ergonomics.
Yeah, ergonomics, because it is a criticism of a whole Swedish business about trying to, positivistically find out the most comfortable chair ever. Joseph makes one realize immediately that comfort is being able to move around in the first place. So there is no absolute ergonomic position, except for, survival conditions, let's say, and I'm thinking of, very much a part of my age, a bomber pilot's position, whatever, in the Second World War, could be seen as an ergonomically sort of definitive. But of course, Joseph is interested in everyday culture, not in extreme circumstances. So I find that essay just breathtaking. And also because it points out that the chair in the same essay was, a position of honor, right?
That's right.
People didn't have chairs, and normally ordinary people did not have chairs. And so it's an amazing what he puts into a very small, short essay is so rich. It just goes in every conceivable direction, and very, very important, I think, for architects and so on. And maybe one might add, that he had been very influenced by Claude Lévi-Strauss. I think that is probably a key figure in his whole approach.
Well, he the title says it's the sitting position, a question of method.
Yes.
Which is very important for him, that he's actually talking about the role of convention, which is what you're mentioning. He says the seats encompass, this is a quote from him, as cathedra in religious placements, benches in courts, sofas in living rooms or stools in work, and for kings, it places them. It has nothing. It's a different kind of comfort, which actually is that of a convention, a social convention, which brings significance to what is the seat otherwise supposed to do. So there is a sense in which his social role in its convention become very important. And for us, as architects, whether it is in the city or whether it is in some kind of role of a, let's say, comfortable chair, as modernists would have it, how it goes beyond this notion of the physical comfort into the domain of the unconscious, and that is, to me, as a sort of contemporary worker in architecture, I find that very critical guideline and directive. And also as a teacher, I use it constantly in the way we use references in architecture.
Yes, yes.
François, let me turn to you quickly, because we have about 8 minutes before we're going to release you for lunch. I was struck this morning when David was presenting and he recounted the story of Joseph saying, "I'm not a guru," and that certainly he was someone who was endlessly curious about other people, and I think that's clearly
I want to...
Please.
No, I never told you something. Over the last time of his life, last year,
Microphone.
Oh, right. Over the past months of Joseph's life, they would be like cat and dog. Give me Kenneth's, call Kenneth to come. You will tell me the same. Tell Joseph. So none of you actually enacted the facts that you had to call each other. So it never happened. I just thought today we're here to remember Joseph, but also remembering places. The book is vital, and places are vital. And I just thought, if we step back a little bit, what I loved about Joseph, talking in the later, when we became very close and friends, and this sort of time off, no performing, and David summarized so much the essence in the morning of the silence. How can you teach and infuse someone through silence? Unique phenomenon. And also the idea of dialogue. So if you say that as architects, we're very doomed because we need to know everything and nothing, and the capacity of picking up fragments to make connections, whether it's music or gardening or anything. For me, that was the most amazing capacity he had of connecting irrelevant things and enthusing you to do that. So a little story, which was when I got the fellowship at the RIBA, 2nd of February 15, I had to bring someone, so I brought my son. We never mixed with architects and all that. So he meets Joseph and Anne. And then I was talking to Anne, and then I leave Jülich, and I was shocked. He's probably the first adult he met that for 10 years that they were together, whenever he was in London, they would click so much. And they started talking about burial and making fun of me and how, and Calvino and all these mixed stories. And there was this profound connectivity between an adult knowing so much. Yuli kept saying, how can you have all this mileage of books in this brain physically, in this head, and yet never show off, never indoctrinate? You got someone and he has to have 2-hour lecture to tell you a simple point, and this guy was the opposite. So the kid was so enthused, and as a musician, he found more inspiration from Joseph than any sort of Royal Academy. Yeah, so I think this sort of, for me, was special. Anyway, we can go on and on.
Javier, let me turn to you to wrap up, because I think we have about 3 or 4 minutes left. So could you talk a little about, you were teaching here, I know, at the Architectural Association for a long period, so yeah. Joseph was certainly a contemporary and colleague of yours at times.
Yeah, well, I was teaching here.
We need microphones.
I was teaching here, and when I used to go, I went there every Sunday, for the last, 5, 6 years? No, perhaps 10 years.
I don't think. Johnson. Okay.
You give me one with those. Can you hear it? Yeah, okay, all right. So in the last 10 years, I saw a lot of him, and you've stolen what I was going to say. The thing that was very remarkable was that he was always listening to me. He was a nobody, right? Now I remember what I was going to say. That he always started the question and said, "What's going on in the AA?" The first thing he would say, "What's going on in the AA?" So I had to actually make a brief summary of what was going on in the AA. I mean, you try and do it, right? Amongst yourselves. But anyway, it was, and so it was, once that was on, it was anything. I mean, one day, talking about books, one day I said to him that I didn't have the moral certainty of having read any book from beginning to end. And then, you know how we all see the smile and sitting back, and but Javier, the books are to be had. You buy a book, you're given a book, you see what all the people have said about the book. You see there, you read what you're interested in, and you put it in the bookcase. And then when you need it, you pick it up. It's to be had. But anyway, so that clarified the attitude into that huge library. But no, he was a person that was ready to listen. When I was in my 5th year, Robin Middleton left the AA and left 4 of us completely orphans, right? So, the only one I could trust was Joseph. So I went to him and I said, look, I'm in this position. I've started this work on the Turin exhibition in 1902. But Robin and he said, well, I know much more about that than Robin, so come here. So he was direct, So I said, great. But that was the same thing with my PhD. So I thought, well, perhaps we could pick up that. And the director of my thesis said, no, don't do that. You're such good friends that in 10 years' time, you'll still be in the first chapter. So you did it with me. And it was true, in the end, it was just bang, 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 and in the period, I finished it. But, and I don't know, perhaps it would have been a distraction, because my relation with him was all in the human level. We talked about architecture, but not a lot. We talked about people, many stories about his friends. I don't know if...
also jokes.
Sorry?
Constant.
It was a fantastic, like the latest Jewish joke he found, and you got the message, one after another. And they were the best possible jokes.
Jokes. His own. I don't know if you know this. Pinnaganchegi is an architect who worked with Chillida in doing those the Combs of the Wind,
Yeah.
So Joseph wanted to speak to Chigida, no? And then a friend of his made it possible. And he told me that he was in a restaurant. And then halfway through, he said to his friends, look, I don't want to see him. But Joseph, it's taking so long. And I've worked so hard in getting this meeting and all that. No, I don't want, but look at them, they're having an argument. And then he said, no, both of them, him and his wife, are completely deaf. They're just, so, and he would tell you these things so straightforward. It was very enjoyable to go and see him. You know.
We are at an end. Thank you all very much. And particularly, I should say, for Marina Engel, who's put together this fantastic lineup over the morning. So notionally, this morning was about teaching, and this afternoon is more focused on practice. But as you can see, it's been a little bit fluid, but we'll roll with the punches. 2 o'clock, everyone back here. So lunch. Thank you very much.